Hi there. Today is Canada Day, July 1st. This is the day Canada was founded back in 1867. But right now, the country is in an uproar because remains were found of Indigenous children. They were part they were part of a system called the Canadian Indian Residential School System. These children were taken from their families among the Indigenous people at various nations all over the country. They were kidnapped, basically. They put in residential schools. These schools were created by the federal government. They were financed by them. And they were run by Christian organizations, for the most part, Roman Catholic organizations. The purpose of that was to basically destroy their culture and turn these Indigenous people into culturally white people, like the colonialists. Okay, so about 4 weeks ago, they were investigating reports of mass graves on the property of a residential school in British Columbia, in Kamloops. They found 215 remains. These are unmarked graves. The stories were already circulating as to the beatings that these children would take. They were physically abused and assaulted. They were sexually molested. Every sort of crime was committed against them, and they had no one to turn to. It's a black mark on the history of Canada, is what it is. So, less than 2 weeks later, 751 remains of young children were found in another residential school in Saskatchewan. Now, the latest one, they've discovered 182 remains. And I stress that these are unmarked mass graves.
There are more.
There were over 150 of these schools in Canada. The first one was in 1831. The last one was closed in 1996.
Wow. Ooh.
So we're talking like over 160 years of sad history. And it was a classic case of ethnic cleansing, basically. It was cultural genocide, is what it was. Now, the history of this never became official. No one had to report that some child had died. They would just bury the child. So most of them, if they're going to be identified today, it will have to be done through, genetic analysis. And before these latest discoveries were made, the approximate number of children who died in these schools was 6,000. Now, they've already found over 1,100, and only 3 schools. Now, let's keep in mind there's another 147 schools to go, and you can bet that
there are more.
Now that they've found this many and only 3 schools, every single one of these
residential schools,
these properties will be examined, and they'll be using the state-of-the-art techniques to find every single one of them, and your heart has to go out to these children. They never did anything wrong. All they wanted was to go home, and most of them were not allowed to go home.
How old are they when they're being taken from their parents and
6.
go to school?
They were 6.
But the other one who talked about this today, she said it's 4 years old when her mother was taken to the residential school.
4 years old.
Yeah.
Great.
She's
I'm
4
still
years
learning
old.
about this myself. I say 6 because when there's no kindergarten, you bring the children into school at the age of 6 for their first grade. But I would think that the clergy would have thought, well, the younger the better, Because it's easier to brainwash them and to change their minds
And
now.
did you hear what you're saying, that they use the brush to clean their skin so that they become white until it becomes red, and then that's too bad, right? It's also a color, because of their color is like mine, so they want them to become white, and so they have to brush their hands until it's become red.
It's inhuman treatment.
Yeah.
And first of all, they were not Indians. They were called Indians. There's still something on the books here in Canada called the Canadian Indian Act. They're not Indians. They're Indigenous people. They're First Nations here. They've been here for 14,000 years or more.
And they are the owner of the lands, and they took their lands.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. Now, colonialists came, took over, and they say, okay, now we run the place. And this is the colonial mindset, the outlook that justifies any sort of crime.
Okay, guys, so please watch my video so you will more enlightened of what happened before. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you for coming out for this Memorial Day and to honor our First Nations people. I want to give a little bit about who I am. My parents, because they were residential school survivors, and their story, and the good. We have to look at the good of things sometimes, right? So, yes, let me encourage you today. Okay, my name is Virginia Brunel. I'm from Cold Lake, Alberta. Woohoo, Cold Lake! And from Cold Lake First Nations, to be exact. And grew up on Cold Lake First Nations, know what it's like to live on the reserve. And as I was growing up, my mother used to tell us of what the stories were like when she went to residential school. And it was very hard for her to be pulled away from her mother and her dad died when she was 4 years old. And they had a big farm, and the people that came for her and her sister, threatened, of course, my grandmother, you don't give up, your children, we're going to put you in jail, right? So that was the thing, that everybody knew that. And so my mother went, of course, with these strangers to Brook Hill School near St. Paul, Alberta. And she was 5 years old. And when she was 14, she left the residential school. But in that time, when she was there, she used to tell me that they gave her a small blanket and didn't give her much to eat because they didn't have the proper nutrition that they should have been giving the First Nations in these residential schools. You know, that my dad was an awesome man. He used to make porridge for us every single morning when we were growing up. And he knew that porridge was good, it kept us a long way, he would say to us. And my mother, she was so sad that she had to stay there for 9 years of her life. My father, on the other hand, didn't talk much about it. I think he went through so much. His parents his mother died when he was young, and his father given up him and his brother to the Onion Lake School in Saskatchewan. And, just by this brokenness from my parents being taken from their parents was a bondage broken. So when they came back every year, they would come back for 2 years. 2 months for summer holidays. And when my grandmother welcomed my mother and her sister, she was so glad to see them, of course. And the first thing she went for was their hair, because apparently the nuns didn't realize, they didn't take care of the lice that was in these children's hair. And my mother she used to tell me that her mother would sit her and her sister down in front of the window, and at that time they didn't have the shampoo to take lice out. And she would sit my mother and her sister Catherine beside the window and pull every one of those lice out of her head, and then every one of those nits as well. And when we were growing up, my mother, if we ever had lice in our head, my mother would do that, the same thing, but we had shampoo though. And my mother would take every single nit out of our head. You know, that's the thing. They may have taken our parents away, but they never took the love and the kindness and the devotion that we have for our children. And that's one thing we must keep and hold on to. That we have to take our children and value them and show them, because we only have them for a short time and then they're adults. So it says, teach a child when they're young, and when they're old, they'll not depart from it. You know, so this is one of the things that we learned as children. I learned from my father to make porridge. He made porridge for us every single morning because he loved us. He would let my mother sleep while he made porridge for us and got us off to school. And that's one thing they valued was school. You know, we have to make sure that we have a good education and that we can teach our children good values. Sometimes we learn these values, you know, by other people, but mostly from our families. So it's a good thing that we're here today to learn about these, you know, stories about people who, you know, have gone through hard times.
Damage done at residential schools doesn't just end. My grandparents both went there, and they brought home a lot of pain with them. And that pain ended up being transferred to their families. And my mother lived and drowned in that sorrow over years. But while she lived, she healed. And she gave that to me as well. And today, I am more whole than I could have expected because of her work. I want to remind you as a community that the pain and the sorrow we're feeling will not be healed in one generation, but that we can do it together over time. And also that we are not alone. In my life, communities reach out to us. The Muslim community, the Chinese community, even the church. Everyone united. We can heal together. I want you to know that it's possible. And I want you to know that together, we aren't alone. Thank you.